Well, good evening, everyone. We've had our little chat, and we'll jump straight into Therapy of Desire by Martha Nussbaum. And I guess we'll just open up by talking about the introduction. After the introduction, when we get to talking about chapter 1, I guess I could say a few things about what I think the chapter's about, and you guys can add to that, and then we will go through it in a kind of, I don't know, chronological fashion, I guess is probably the easiest way. So I don't know how you guys want to tackle this. I've just made some notes basically. So
Me too.
Yeah. So did you make some notes, Shannon, or?
Yeah, I did. I'm all for chapter 1. I didn't realize we were doing the intro, but
Well, I think we'll just race through the introduction because that really just touches on a kind of general idea of what the book's about rather than what the chapter 1's about. So
Yes.
basically, she says pretty much early out that the Hellenistic philosophers are as doctors of the soul. So I think the idea being that there were doctors of the body, and they thought then that, and she gives a few different examples of quotes, doesn't she, from Epicurus? Or is that in chapter 1? And Cicero and the like. Maybe that's in chapter 1.
That's chapter 1.
So they're the doctors of the soul then. But unlike popular religion and magic, they were dedicated to the careful argumentation, the explicitness, comprehensiveness, and the rigor that have usually been sought by philosophy. So careful argumentation there. And an intense focus. Yeah, however, there's an intense focus on the state of desire and thought in the pupil. And that made them, the Hellenistic philosophers, seek a newly complex understanding of human psychology and led them to adopt complex strategies. And of course, we should say which Hellenistic philosophies we're talking about. So obviously, these are the philosophies that come just after Plato. So Aristotle, yeah, the skeptics. You guys want to say the last two?
Yeah, the Epicureans and the Stoics.
Yeah. Can you say something briefly about the differences? There's a challenge.
Well, yes, the Epicureans were actually separated themselves from society. That was one of their more bigger expectations or their suggestions for curing the ills of the psychology of the patient, to live in a community outside of normal society and live in friendship. And the skeptics didn't want, just denied any ability to reach knowledge in its true form, and that it was unable to be found.
Hi, Judith.
Yeah.
Hi.
Oh, here she is. Hello, Judith.
Hi.
We just started on the introduction. We just had a bit of a chat, and we're just saying what's the difference between the Hellenistic philosophies, just a kind of broad brush kind of idea, and Jody was just mentioning that. Obviously, we know how Stoicism is different from the Epicureans, right?
Yeah.
Aristotle is kind of an interesting case. I always find it difficult to kind of point at what is very different about Aristotle. I find this book helpful in describing Aristotle's philosophy, actually, because when you read about him, you just think, well, what's he doing that's so different? But it's because I think he resembles what we'd find in sociology or something like that. He seems almost modern in some respects. I don't know. Does that sound right, or is that way off?
Well, I think Aristotle's different just because he's so comprehensive. You know, there was no subject on which he wasn't authoritative. So, in a sense, and because so much of his stuff survives, right? Unlike just about every other ancient thinker apart from Plato. So that's partly why he's different, but I mean, yeah, obviously he has different emphases from the Stoics and the other heirs of Plato. But yeah, I think you're right, Courtney. I think it's useful how Nussbaum characterizes Aristotle in this context. So I think, yeah, I mean, I love this introduction. I think, and chapter 1, I think she sets out the landscape really well.
Yeah. And just quickly tearing through the introduction then, well, it's probably a good point here, Judith. Since you've set that kind of idea up, you like this introduction and you like the first chapter. What did you think of it, Shannon?
The introduction's fine. The first chapter, some of it, like the way she structures things, I think, like from a writing perspective, is really bad. But overall, like I'd find it agreeable. But there's like certain things that are like jagged rocks that stick out. They sort of prick me on the way as I'm reading through it. It's like, why is this here? This is like, and it puts me off the rest of it. But probably overall, it's not actually that bad.
Jody, do you have anything? What did you think about it?
Oh, I loved it. I just really found it such a wonderful project, and it's a book I would love to have written myself, to be honest. I really am enjoying it. You asked me before just to talk briefly about the different schools, and I just should clarify that a bit better from the introduction, that she felt that Aristotle, yes, was more about conditions for a good life, and also the expectations on politics to bring these about, whereas the Epicureans were more in line with a complete withdrawal from the city. And she mentions how the skeptics had an uncritical obedience to the forces of external conventions, even though they had very firm understanding of the difficulty of achieving or finding truth, but they still agreed to live within the conventions of society. And then the Stoics, she says, pointed out that a wise person's indifference, if you like, to indifference to, I think, the expectations of politics, possibly. And all the schools taught internal changes, but isn't the inner world a function of social and material conditions? And therefore, she then talks about Marx. She mentions Marx as well, doesn't she? And how Marx shifted from Epicurus to Aristotle. And the only other thing that I wrote down was, but the thing they hold in common, though, is that Aristotle and the Hellenistic thinkers agree that human flourishing cannot be achieved without the transformation of desire and thought. Yeah, so they all agreed on that.
Great. And one thing that's important, probably interesting, and lines up with Hadot as well, is that idea of that the texts are complex philosophical and literary wholes in themselves, she says, and that in a sense that's the reason she picks the Roman Stoic sources in particular, in that she can read the whole text, and that she makes claims about how difficult it is to really appreciate the intricacies of the philosophy if you can't analyze the text as a whole, and that it's not merely a kind of abstract kind of what's the word, kind of that Platonic idea that she's contrasting it to, that abstraction. It's just that it also captures something of the culture and its place in history, and that becomes something that she wants to analyze too, as opposed to what often gets done in analytic philosophy, I think. Would you agree with that, Judith?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I found that so refreshing because, as you know, also, Courtney, in Stoic circles, a lot of the time, and people don't necessarily even you know, they don't necessarily feel strongly about it, but they tend to regard, say, Seneca as less authoritative than Zeno or Chrysippus or Cleanthes, notwithstanding the fact we actually have only fragments, and the most rudimentary fragments at that, of Zeno, Chrysippus, and Cleanthes, and it's secondhand. You know, so I think that was really refreshing, that she reminds everybody that these philosophies were in context. You know, they were in culture. They weren't isolated. They weren't, some kind of Platonic ideal out there in the ether. They were embodied and they were cultural. And that, I think that's a really important, one of the many important things she was doing here. But so Shannon, I'm just curious as to what you think she does really badly, because I'm with Jodie. I think it's just an absolute tour de force.
Yeah, it's more in that first chapter. And it's just like there's a few points where it's really bad. I guess we'll probably go into the more detail, but to pick one that comes to immediate mind is like she's like describing what's meant by nature. And she goes through about 2 or 3 paragraphs of like, these are 2 different ways you can think of nature. That's not what I'm talking about. And it's like, okay, why did you have all of these paragraphs going through? I understand why, because it's like addressed in the modern view, but there's just so much there, and it's a very short section. And then she sort of goes, oh, well, actually, like by nature, it's actually closer to personhood. But then it's like, it feels like at the end of the chapter, it's like, okay, but what are you actually meaning by nature? Like, it doesn't seem like we've gone on to something like some concept to really like grasp onto solidly. It's sort of just, yeah, it doesn't really lay it out as clearly as I think it could. Not to say like it is a challenging thing to do, but it's just, she doesn't do herself any favors. That'd just be one example.
All right. We're nearly at the end of the introduction. I just wanted to say too that, as I was saying before, she obviously recognizes the embeddedness of culture in studying this kind of philosophy, and that's something that the medical analogy will recognize, as opposed to the Platonic kind of view, which tends to stand outside and think of truth as extra historical, I think she says. And I think she really plays on that in a really subtle way by bringing herself into the story in a lot of ways. Like, I feel that this is a very personal text in some ways. And I get that because, for example, her use of the character Nikidian, which actually doesn't make a lot of sense to bother with unless she's bringing herself as a young woman into the narrative of the story, if you see what I'm saying. And I've made this point before, last time we read it, I think. And because Nikidian means little victory as well. So there's sort of subtle connections and things going on. There's obviously a bit of a feminist dialogue going on too, because her interest is also in the treatment of marginalized women. So she brings in the idea of the Indian women and how they've been treated. I know there's probably some sort of background research she was interested in previously, but you know what I mean? I think she's drawing on her own experiences through academia. And we know, for example, that Nikidian was called a harlot in that story. Is it by Tacitus or someone? Can't remember by whom. That maybe Epicurus had been sleeping with Nikidian, and that she may have been a kind of
Courtesan.
A courtesan, sorry, my bad. But also there's a personal story that Martha Nussbaum tells that we know from previous reading, that when she was a PhD student, I think, one of her lecturers touched her breast and told her that she was like a hetaria. Is that how you pronounce it? Like a courtesan. So I feel there's a real kind of way of writing herself in a sense, which...
Yeah, except for the parts that I find frustrating, which is more structural rather than the word-to-word thing. Like, I do think she writes like very well for this type of thing. Like, she's not a dry writer, even when she's just giving like the history thing. I think she does a good job, and I wouldn't even be able to point out exactly how she does it. but there is something where even when she's engaging with fairly dry facts, it's made fairly engaging. Like it's not as dry as it could be. But like if I wrote it, it would be way drier than this.
I think she's an absolute genius, because you take the topic, right? She says, these philosophers claim that the pursuit of logical validity, intellectual coherence, and truth delivers freedom from the tyranny of custom and convention, creating a community of beings who can take charge of their own life, story, and their own thought. This whole idea of the medical analogy preserves the importance of the use of argument and you know, in the development of a kind of ethic which engages the personal desires and all the deep needs and wants of the person, but at the same time takes into account the kind of place in society, the historicity and all that sort of stuff, which, you know, like, I don't mean to harp on, but that's exactly what she's doing with her own person in the background, in telling such a dry academic kind of telling. It's, I mean, maybe I'm overdoing it, but I think that's incredible.
Yeah, I think it's amazing what she does. And yeah, you're right about the just various, I mean, your point about the nature thing, Shannon, I actually felt the opposite about that passage. I thought, because that's a subject you could write a whole essay on, right? Is the, you know, the whole idea of nature in ancient philosophy, and nature versus culture, and nature versus law, and laws of nature. You could go on for pages, but I think she actually spends a paragraph doing it and kind of still giving you the overall overview pretty well. You know, she doesn't go into the absolute nitty gritty, but she conveys the whole issue in a pretty succinct way. And I think she does that over and over again. You know, takes really quite a significant issue and presents it in a way that is both engaging and comprehensible. You know, and really, I think particularly in academic texts, that's so rare. You know, if people don't, people tend to get on their hobby horses, or they get bogged down, or they go off on a tangent. She's always focused, and I think she always gets to the point.
Yeah, I think that's what makes it frustrating though, is like I feel like there's some parts where it's like, oh, like this part like structurally could have been a lot better laid out. And it feels even more annoying because it's like she feels confident, like everything around it feels really competently made. And there's just this one these glaring points with like, why are you like doing it this way? Yeah. Should we jump into chapter 1 then?
Yeah, can I just make one little point there that I took from the introduction, just as a final thing, that as a little summary, really, that idea that the practical commitment to this medical analogy, this practical commitment it acts as a combination of logic with compassion, and that's what I found really there, and that seems to come through quite a lot in chapter 1 at least, and probably throughout the rest of the book. That idea that you know, they're not against emotion, and they're using emotion or their compassion, in a sense, to bring forward logical argument as the conduit through which to bring improvement. You know, so yeah, it was just that interesting bringing together logic and compassion. Anyway,
yeah, you're right. She says she endorses the practical commitment. It's a combination of logic with compassion. But she also then highlights what she thinks might be problematic about the Hellenistic account, which she then says she wants to explore in the book, and that's its advocacy of various types of detachment and freedom from disturbance.
Yes.
And the consequences of that, which we already see in chapter 1 aren't as straightforward as they seem. It's how it might suggest. And just before we get into 1 too, I'll quickly end with this whole idea of embeddedness in history, and that also she thinks that the medical analogy in the Hellenistic philosophy is really targets, because they're looking at the way in which social conventions often get in the way of the flourishing of individuals and of groups. And she says in particular that Epicurus, for example, is concerned about the role of religion, and Lucretius was interested in social practices like love and marriage, and the Stoics questioned gender and class and the moral salience of national boundaries, for example. And she reminds us that the idea of universal respect for the dignity of humanity was originally a Stoic idea.
Yep.
I'm happy to go to chapter 1 now that we've got
Yeah,
that out of the way.
I had comments on the first part of chapter 1.
Okay,
So where
fire
it has
away.
that Epicurus quote, where it's got, empty is that philosopher's argument by which no human suffering is therapeutically treated. Just as there is no use in the medical art that does not cast out the sickness of the bodies, so too there is no use in philosophy unless it casts out the suffering of the soul. Now, there's like one way you can interpret this where like you could trivialize this to the point that it is true, but then I think you've pretty much captured all of philosophy. Or I think if you take it like in a more direct way, I don't think it is. Like, it seems like a very limited way to view philosophy. Like something that I think would be a pretty clear example would be like philosophy of mathematics. Like it doesn't really have any direct impact on treating the therapy of the soul. It's still
But what you're touching on there, obviously, is going to be her general idea, right? She's going to say, in general, there's like 3 different kinds of approach to philosophy in the ancient world. Your mathematics idea will obviously fit with the Platonic conception, right?
not necessarily though, because there'd be people who are arguing for a different ontology, like a different way that mathematics is. So the Platonic ideal would be like there's numbers sort of floating up, but would be another different philosophy of mathematics that would have existed. And so it seems limited to say that. And then it also too is like when you're trying to sort of bring this, like this is probably a challenge of any quotes of these across school. It's like with the Stoics of like the human suffering. It's like, well, like they're kind of happy with or not happy, but indifferent to the human suffering in some ways, in other ways not. But like they have very different meanings of what that actually is. It's like there's like if you were to like go and say like how to treat that as a Stoic quote, all the words in there have very different meaning from the Epicurus one. So it kind of is like because she further down says that like the Stoics would vigorously endorse this picture of philosophy. And it's kind of like, well, they would, but they would have very different meanings from
Sure. But let's start more generally. Like you're going in and out there, like from the general to the specific. I mean, sorry,
Yeah.
Judith, you go.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think, well, I think part of what you're getting at, Shannon, is something that was raised by the classicist John Cooper in response to Pierre Hadot. And the idea is that, well, you know, ancient philosophy is actually a lot more academic, if you like, than it is therapeutic, or at least as much academic as it is therapeutic. And so I think that's a real crux of how we understand ancient philosophy. Having said that, and we're not going to resolve that, but I think there is a strong, I think Nussbaum has a strong basis for her argument here, because for instance, if you know, reading Seneca's letters, as Simon and I've been doing sort of pretty consistently over a year, this is something he comes back to again and again, that academic investigation and debate and argument is not worth as much as the betterment of the person and he actually talks in terms of, as Nussbaum says, the alleviation of suffering, the alleviation of people's anguish, people's suffering in the world. So you know, I think she's spot on with her identification of that issue. Whether we agree as to whether that's the you know, the sum total of philosophy or not, but certainly there's a strong case to be made that for the Stoics, the the logic and mathematics and grammar and all the other things they investigated, because you know they were great investigators of everything, were all subordinated to the health of the soul. There's a strong case for that.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like that, and that's that thing where I was saying, like, it's sort of like you can sort of have this interpretation of it where it's like you take it in a more broad form, where it's like, well, like their logic was like driving down towards something like the therapeutic ends. I think it's probably my issue is the absoluteness of the quote. It's a bit like, well, it's not the be all end all, but yeah.
In a way, she's getting at this idea, right, that what the kind of truth that we're talking about in this book is not so much an abstract truth, but an ethical norm of human health, right? And that maybe is what is a bit off-putting, perhaps, is that it's not truth in some broader sense. It's aimed at what the good life looks like, for example. And her argument is kind of going in that direction. But in general, right, isn't she saying, this is a bit of an overview as I see it, that there's at least 3 different ways of thinking of philosophical projects of this time. That's kind of what she's saying. She's saying there's this approach, what we're talking about now, this medical analogy, which is people driven by a sense and of urgency to come to meet the needs of people who are facing suffering and distress and misfortune, and what can philosophy to do that, and how can it use the established principles of argumentation and like to, you know, to protect them or to give them an opportunity to live best possible life they can. Then there's this other approach which seems to precede it, the Platonic approach. And she said it's general and it's not exactly like Plato's view. It's more, but it is a way that view could have been understood in that time. And that is very abstract. It's very mathematical. And she says later on that makes its way into the modern era in the form of science and religion. And otherwise, the third way of looking at it is from the ordinary belief point of view, which is broadly speaking utilitarian, and it uncritically accepts the kind of common opinion of the mass as sort of healthy and a decent enough kind of criteria by which you can go by. So in a sense, she's saying 2 different things, right? She's pointing out the differences and contrasting those 3 kinds of things, and also she's showing how the medical analogy takes advantage of the strength, in a sense, of the ordinary belief approach and the Platonic approach, because she says it has the power of reasoning that the Platonic approach has, that acute analysis, but it also has the interest in practical affairs that the common opinion approach has. So I think she's saying it's you can see how these things arise out of a kind of interaction with one another, and that it's a kind of a refinement in the direction of, like you were saying, Judith and Jody, a response to human need and that arising sense of compassion that comes out of being in the world with other people. Sorry for that long waffle.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff there that I think she does a really bad job with actually arguing for. But it'd probably be better just working our way through, because then I'll be jumping through like quite far ahead.
But I'm glad that I pointed out those 3 things, because that's entirely what the chapter's about.
Yep.
So quickly jumping in, my first notes are basically to say that she says that the medical analogy is not a decorative metaphor. That's what I was really just going on about. Once we have understood philosophy, the task in a general way as being like a doctor's task, one can then rely on that general understanding to find out more concretely and in greater detail how the philosopher ought to proceed in a variety of circumstances. And it's not isolated to the self, this project. It's generally or broadly about identifying norms of health and identifying practices that can be used to help people, yes.
So the other thing to remember here too is that in some senses, the discipline as we have it now of psychology arose simply because philosophy, narrowly understood, had abandoned the therapeutic angle. You know, we're talking in probably from the Renaissance through to the 19th century, when medicine proper was, was making huge advances, but there was a gap. You know, philosophy was no longer addressing the soul. Medicine was addressing the body. There was a gap, and so psychology, as we understand it now, came to fill that gap, for better or for worse. But in antiquity, there was no separate study of the soul. It was part of philosophy, but in a sense, I think that makes her claim about the therapeutic whole is less controversial, or should be less controversial, because it was simply one more aspect of the whole person, or the whole person in the world. You know, it wasn't, in a sense, if we think of it separate, we're putting a post ancient spin on it already. She's trying to go back to a worldview, really, where there wasn't a separation between philosophy, the soul, and the body.
And of course, right, I just had two ideas simultaneously, so I got confused. But basically, if we think of Socrates, right, he's in a slightly different connection. Oh yeah, first I was going to say, sorry, that just as Epicurus is pointing out, there's clearly an art for healing the body. So what about all the people who are suffering emotionally and of the passions? Like, you know, isn't that a part of human life? So it would necessarily, there must be a science or an art to deal with that. So why not philosophy? And the other thing I was going to say, of course, is Socrates uses that example all the time, and he's constantly been criticized for talking about craftsmen and bakers and shoe cobblers and doctors, you know. So there's something very practical and about that.
And he describes himself as a midwife. You know, what's more practical than a midwife? That's the analogy he gives of himself in bringing forward, helping people to bring forward their ideas. That's a crux where you've got the body and the mind in close connection, and Socrates is making that connection.
So we're still in part 1 of chapter 1. It's quite short. There's one little thing I would say, just to raise a question. This idea of it being, you know, the medical analogy is devoted to the achievement of human flourishing using these principles of reason. It made me think, you know, the difference between, say, a modern doctor at least, and maybe even an ancient doctor, and say the philosophical doctor, just as a talking point, is how would you feel about seeing a psychologist whose life was in a mess? Probably differently than if you saw a doctor who he could be diabetic, right, and overweight and not really caring about his own health, but you might still trust him as a doctor. But there's something about the picture of the philosophical doctor where we imagine that he must have undergone the work himself and that his soul had been worked on in order for him to qualify to be a doctor of this type.
Yeah,
Well,
I think a lot of people have that intuition, but that's definitely not one I would have for a psychologist. I would care about like the experience, and that, like, for myself, I find it helpful when I'm engaged with them. I don't think I really would care, but I reckon many people would. But I think they would also care about that, of the same view about the doctor as well. In both cases, I think this is irrational. Was not a justified position.
And hasn't that changed over time? Because we would imagine if you went to see an orator, maybe not an orator, but some sort of philosopher in ancient times, you'd expect that not only could he transform you, but that he had been transformed himself. But we don't have that high standard for psychologists these days.
But you know, if you go for, because you did talk already about section 2 when you were talking about the Platonic approach and the scientific approach and the religious approach associated with that Platonic approach, and then you brought in you know, the bit about in section 3 about the social, you know, the normal, ordinary, accepted views of society, and then. But he does say at page, I don't know if it's too far to jump, but he talks about on page 27 in section 3, he says the normative picture of good ethical judgment and of the healthy judge. She talks about the healthy judge to guide the pupil. So she brings that in a few times, you know, that idea of, you know, that the psychologist or the Stoic therapist, the Hellenistic philosopher, would be able to indeed be the healthy judge and guide the pupil. This judge is from the human community and represents an ideal of the flourishing life to which the patient aspires. And it's an asymmetrical model. She brings up that a few times, the asymmetrical model of the teacher and pupil or the doctor and patient. Yeah, so that's in there too.
Well, that idea of asymmetry implies that the philosopher teacher is not merely using a technique, for example, but rather he has an expert eye, which has come because he has transformed his character along the lines that the ethics is aimed to direct humanity in general, right? So I guess my question is like, I don't know. I think it's a fascinating one. How can we let modern doctors off the hook so easily, especially what we call
but I don't think
mentors
this is a rational position to hold. Like,
why
do you think so? Like, why is it relevant?
Why?
Because so if someone, because like it's like inbuilt, you have this idea that it's easy to solve, that problems are easy to solve, but sometimes some problems aren't easy to solve.
But
I think
how
that's
do you
the
know?
difference. I don't have this view. I view things as difficult. I view things as challenging. So, you know, that people are on the journey. So like whether it's philosopher, psychologist, or doctor.
Well, I guess the question is, if you're in the business of helping people fix themselves, you'd like to think that that person has fixed themselves first, right?
No.
Well, but this is something that, well, but I think the ancient body of theory would be that, yes, a teacher is, you select a teacher on the basis of their personal example as much as anything else, you know, their personal transformation, their personal journey, their personal qualities, insofar as you're aware of them. And those are the qualifications to be a teacher. You know, it's less credentialism and more character. So whether you know, I don't know why you would say it's irrational, Shannon. It seems pretty reasonable to me.
Because I think someone who can teach is different than someone who achieves. So I can have so like the qualities of a teacher are like are separate from the qualities of a master. It might happen to
those who can, what is it? Those who can't, those who can do and those who can't teach.
But
it's a skill. Like most, like I know they have that like joke thing to like undermine teachers, but it is a skill to teach people. That is a talent to like drive people and to give them motivation. Like this is a skill which could be separate. Like because you could have someone who say like who's like the fastest runner. They're not going to be necessarily the best runner coach.
Oh yeah, true. And yeah, often the best players don't make very good coaches. We know that. But that's a different point. You know, the point I think is would you want your airline pilot to be taught by airline pilots? I think you would. Would you want your surgeon to be taught by surgeons? I think you would. So I don't think so in that sense, I don't think the person's personal experiences are irrelevant.
Yeah, no, I do definitely agree with that, but I think the distinction is, so maybe there is a lot more agreement than I think there is. But the distinction I'm seeing is like, to use the surgeon analogy, like you don't necessarily need the best surgeon who never made a mistake. You can still have the surgeon that's made errors and will make errors in the future, and they might be the better teacher than the one who is the world-class surgeon.
That's true.
It doesn't seem like that the level of skill automatically equals to the quality of teaching or motivating or whatever.
But I don't think that I don't think Nussbaum's, I don't think that's in play here. I think
No,
it's more.
Cool.
I don't
I might
think
have
it is.
misunderstood.
Yeah, no, they're trying to see the analogy here with the normative idea of health, even, you know, like the normative idea of physical health, and then bringing it against as a comparison to mental health. Because even if you go to page 26, and she's talking about, well, just quickly, can I just read a quick summary? You know, the doctor treats the patient, the doctor considers the patient's beliefs, judgments, desires, which are not necessarily truth, but these are not the seat of the disease, whereas medical moral philosophy deals with these as the actual problem. And it just quickly, society has infected people with its sicknesses, and young people brought up with the deformed views and values and corruptions of wealth, power, and status. You know, and she's going on about, you know, everything that depends on the patient's unreliable report. So always the doctor or the philosopher is getting brought forward as the specialist or the expert, you know. And then she says the you know, in that sense, the physical, sorry, you follow the analogy, the Hellenistic philosophers follow the analogy with physical health more strictly, insisting that they need to operate with a normative idea of a flourishing life, you know. So they do have this sort of not a platonic normative thing outside, but within the human experience and judged by humans and these philosophers themselves, insisting that they need to operate with the normative idea. And the philosopher hopes that all or most patients will assent to the diagnosis and participate willingly in the cure. That's on page 26 anyway.
Are we able, just to jump back, because I think I have some points about that, but we need to go. My issues sort of come up a bit earlier.
Yeah, before we jump too far ahead, I agree. Going back to what we were talking about, and I think it links to Jodi's point though, Shannon, is that the kind of doctor the medical analogy is talking about in his critique of society as a cause of ills and things like that, and the asymmetry of power between the doctor and the patient, would imply deeply that this guy, this woman, doctor, has some very special and significant insight into the issue at hand. So he has been, if not transformed himself, is in the process of being transformed. He understands exactly the kind of procedure that's required to ask very deep and searching questions of the patient. A person who's faking it can't do that, and a person who doesn't understand the process can't do that. That's what I'm getting at.
I would absolutely agree with this. And but just to underline something you said there, in the process of being transformed, that's the part to me that's so that means that people aren't going to be when you see the psychologist, they're not necessarily going to have everything in order. And so there is a process of being transformed. That's why I think you can't make the instantaneous judgment on their life. And besides that, I don't think it actually even matters in the case of a psychologist.
Well, it matters here. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I don't think it matters in the case of philosophy, but that's because I just sometimes don't think that's much value. But
I think Wittgenstein would disagree with you.
Well, it's all word games all the way down. I don't know. He might have some agreement. But just to jump back to the start of section 2, so I think this starts my. This is probably one of my, in terms of structure of this chapter, it's probably one of my more annoyances for 2 reasons. So at the start of it, she's like, okay, let's look at two approaches that were available in ancient Greece. We're going to call one Platonic and the other ordinary belief. Now, she does immediately like go, oh, I don't actually mean real Platonic, real Plato. I just mean like a version of Plato from Aristotle. But it just kind of feels like this is because she's trying to create this, like, there's these three ideas that exist. And it just feels like it would have been better to use an alternative name. And then as well, and so she's contrasting this with the Hellenistic philosophers. But then when she gets to the final end of this section, or it feels that way anyway, she's then going to be like, oh, but the Stoics were also Platonists. She doesn't say that exactly, but they had some Platonist tendencies, which I think makes it a bit more murky.
It's very murky. The whole thing's murky, and to try and indicate that it wasn't would be misleading. So I think, but I don't think it's a problem that she characterizes the Platonic approach in this way. I think it's a way that people can understand, and it's close enough to a Platonic kind of viewpoint. But also, and I think what's relevant too is that she contrasts or sort of also describes the Augustinian approach with the focus on, you know, God and whatever God wants being the version. But of course, and just one of the few points I wanted to make with this was that those two things are unrelated. As we know, Augustine was strongly influenced by Platonic models. So in a sense, the Augustinian model was Platonic as well. So there's these two, broadly speaking, Platonic models. But yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the sort of the history of the early Stoa and the sort of the Middle Academy, they were cross-fertilizing and cross-pollinating all the way along. So that's why it is murky, and that's why I think she is right to point out that the Stoics were also influenced by the Platonic view.
I absolutely agree, but it's just more that I feel like, so this is that thing of like the structure of how she wrote it. I just wish that she had have made that more clear at the onset of like that it's not there's going to be that crossover like with the Stoics, or that it's not a completely separated. I don't know. It just doesn't feel reading it, because it was kind of like, but this is just like some parts of it. I was just like, but this is the Stoic sage. Was like my notes next to it. And then it's like, oh, okay. No, she does know that, but it's just sort of buried, like she's buried the lead. And it's like, like it's not wrong in that way. But yeah. And so just one other.
Keep going. Yeah.
Now let me just find this point. Oh yeah. So when she's presenting the Plato, like the Christians, and she goes, this is on page 19 at the top, digging more deeply into ourselves is not the right way to proceed in ethical inquiry in relation to the Platonists. Now, for Christians, and I will concede my ignorance on Augustine, but they could just have the view that, there is like this good that exists, but we have access through it via the glory of God. Like, so we do actually have that intuition comes through via God. Like, I don't see what that seems like.
But this is the thing, like, you're focusing, I think, on the wrong words. Like you just said, digging into ourselves. Well, she's kind of meaning something a little bit more than that. Like, for example, why is she calling that the Platonic model? She's saying that in the Platonic model, doesn't matter what you call it or whatever, this way of looking at things, whether it be physical sciences or the Augustinian thing, is that truth exists out there, independent of you, independent of human beings. It's part of the fabric of being. And it doesn't even have to be in accord with your life, your needs, your wishes, your desires. If it is, it's purely accidental, possibly. It could be inimical. It could be completely alien to our desires. And that's the point she's making about how it connects with Christianity, because It could be that God just says, well, you shouldn't have eaten the apple. Well, I didn't eat a fucking apple. That's original sin, you know? That's something that's just part of an abstract story that exists way outside of my life that I just have to abide by. Or they got predestination. I guess that's similar to the Stoics. I shouldn't use that example, but you know, there's things like that. And she says, she's like, imagine the Platonic doctor saying, "You're hungry."
Oh,
That's
no.
health.
Wait, no, because we'll get to that later. I
Yeah.
have a lot of things on that. But just
But-
on, so the point you sort of made there, though, is it does not have to incur with our desires, but it can incur with our desires. So this is different from it being that the good could be the case that it does incur with our desires under a Platonic model, like that we have some sort of access or some way to get to them. And that's, it sort of feels like it's not made explicit, so maybe it'd be harsh to say that she is actually doing this. But the feeling I get from this is it's kind of like the Platonic good does not necessarily have to agree with our desires. Therefore, it does not agree with our desires. But but it doesn't follow from what's going on, like what's there with the Platonists. Like there can still be this access to it. I have no idea what that actually means because I find it gets a bit weird, but there at least would be people who would make that type of argument.
Oh, yeah, I mean, in certain dialogues, so in the symposium, when Diotima is talking about the ladder of love, she's laying out something that is theoretically a path that is desirable and that is good for people. You know, they'll start off desiring beautiful bodies and then they'll start desiring beautiful souls, and it's I mean, maybe Nussbaum has sort of elided some of those subtleties and some of those variations, but I think in broad, I can't argue with her broad characterization. You know, as I say, I think she's referring to what we read in the Phaedrus, if you remember, the idea that there's this sort of celestial goings on that beings drop in and out of, and yeah, it's pretty well unrelated to human concerns, broadly speaking. So I think there's certainly a warrant in Plato's works for her position here, even if there are subtleties and there are variations and there might be wrinkles, particularly in the symposium. So I mean, yeah, maybe she's generalizing a bit, but I can't see that she's generalizing unreasonably. But then I'm not a Plato expert, so I don't know.
Yeah. So where the unreasonableness, I feel, where I'm on very solid ground, is when she's given the analogy of the heavenly doctor. Which, like, so that they've got, like, you know, that you see the condition that a poor old woman, they're intolerably painful and crippling. Well, that's actually the example of what health is. But like it just feels like such a caricature of like what it could be. Because like it seems like and this is why it's important that there is that the intuitions could have access to the Platonic realm is an important thing, because the Platonists could say, well, this is not a fair representation because through our intuitions, we can have access to this with rational reflection or something, I don't know, whatever they would say. And that we would know that that's not the type of health in the true sense of the word, but that exists sort of floating out there. It just seems like such an unfair representation of the Platonist.
But if you're talking about normative health, that might be another way to understand it. So the medical analogy is saying something like you have to interrogate the life, the concreteness and the specific nature of the life of the person in order to find out what their hopes and desires and wishes are, and then kind of apply your method, your procedure to that, and with that, in order to, find something that improves their lot, basically. But the other method, the Platonic method, wouldn't even be interested in the particulars of the person's life. It's just a method or a formula. Like, you could imagine an occult scientist in the Middle Ages perhaps saying, well, if I just inscribe these glyphs on a talisman and the person wears that talisman, then their life will be magically transformed in terms of health or whatever. It doesn't actually do what the medical analogy is suggesting. So, and we know that these occultists in the Middle Ages were interested in these Platonic interpretations that came to them through Arabic occult sources and stuff like that. So, you know what I mean? That shows you how a medical kind of procedure would be quite different.
And
So you
it's
don't think? Oh,
Oh, sorry. It just occurred to me too that we don't even have to think about the Middle Ages, right? We can think about some pretty top-down approaches to health in general, possibly in not maybe our lifetimes, but certainly in our parents' lifetimes, which have imposed, things again. I mean, I can't think of an example, but if you look at the history of science in the 20th century, there's been some pretty dodgy and horrendous top-down approaches taken, not really taking into account the circumstance of the individuals, not really taking a properly therapeutic approach. So I think maybe she's gesturing towards not just, this imagined Platonist approach, but maybe to sort of top-down approaches generally in regard to physical and psychic health, which we may have seen cases of. Just a thought.
No, but that's spot on, Judith, because you can imagine, and there's plenty of critique in modern anti-psychiatry because, and this is exactly the point I reckon that she could be making too, is that what good is it to use psychopharmacological medicines to cure a person of depression, for example, without listening to the client, without talking to the client, without looking into why their life is so depressed in the first place. So nothing changes then. It's not about the client. It's only about treating the bioelectrical mechanisms in the brain that cause a certain kind of behavioral reaction. And that's the kind of language that gets used. It's the language of neuroscience, which she would probably argue is as abstract as the language of Platonic metaphysics, for example.
Can I have a little comment there? Just to say that, I understand, Shannon, where you're coming from, but I think she's just trying to illustrate very strongly the idea that it can't be from outside. It has, and she does say it's an immersed art. It's something that it's an engaged, immersed art, working in a pragmatic partnership with those it treats. So it can't be separated from the patient's own sense of better or worse. Like it's got to be a partnership. It's not from outside. It has to be from within. Yeah, I just don't.
Yeah. So it seems like you guys think that this is like a reasonable analogy then, a fair one, which is definitely not my impression. Now, I want to go through a few points there. So without listening to the client, without considering the client, and yeah, absolutely. So I'm like putting on my Platonist hat. I'm like, yeah, no, absolutely, I agree. That was terrible. Because the problem was in those cases where they were given the medicinal drugs, is that they hadn't actually had correct access to the Plato realm of correct type of healing. So through listening to the patient, this can actually help the heavenly doctor better understand, to have access to what the correct way of treating the patient is. Like, it seems like there is like some like the Platonists can clearly like defend this position. I don't see.
But aren't you really just arguing that the Platonist has become a medical doctor? Like
No.
It's almost like a Venn diagram, right? There's Platonic doctor, ordinary belief. Oh, in the middle, you've got the medical analogy, He takes from the best of both of them, kind of goes the argument, but he doesn't want to neglect one for the other, because he does need to care, or she does need to care what is going on in the culture and the history and the personal life. She needs to know all that. She needs to be informed about that, but she also needs to know how to use argument and logic and discourse and dialectic in that strictly Platonic kind of way as well. She deeply respects the power of logos.
Yeah, I don't know how else I can express it without saying the same thing, because it's just to me it just seems blindingly clear that the Platonist can work in this way, still being just a Platonist. But then,
Well,
so you're saying that.
Sorry, I'm just going to quit. That just like, because it says people on page 20. People can go wrong about their health, so they have to be convinced of their state and need for treatment. So that's implying again a normative approach, right? That's implying that sort of maybe a wisdom or a world of knowledge that is beyond the human patient's ability to understand, and that the therapist, the philosopher, the Hellenistic philosopher, has this sort of normative approach. And is that what you mean by that Platonic idea? Is that what you're getting at?
So what Nussbaum's meaning by the Platonic idea? Yeah.
No,
so
because when you're saying, the ability for the Platonic approach for the medical doctor is acceptable, is viable as an illustration. Is that because are we talking about the normative idea of health?
Nussbaum's talking about the normative idea of health.
But is that still within the human realm? You're putting it outside the human realm into the out there Platonic realm?
I don't quite know what you mean. Sorry.
Well, yeah. I just thought you were trying to bring it in from the idea of the idea of health being external and Platonic in the sense of
but there's
out there.
Yes, that is what I mean. Yeah, or at least the position I'm trying to defend. Not to say that I think it's actually true. I just think Nussbaum's not giving them a fair shake with this.
That it's
analogy.
possible. That you're saying it's a possible position.
Yeah, and that she's not really like fairly engaging with them, and it's almost like they're like that they're autistic, like that they're like absolutely narrow-minded, and there's like some character flaw within them. But even someone who thought that has like arguments and reasons for this Platonic thing, and like they're the heavenly doctor, to continue the analogy in that sense, like it seems even they would have an understanding that doesn't mean that they have perfect access to the Platonic realm. And it seems like they would be open to that ability of being wrong and adjusting.
Well, I mean, I think maybe a sort of a more a clear illustration of maybe what you're getting at, Shannon, and you know maybe I'm wrong here, but if we accept that the Augustinian example is a version of the Platonic example, so the idea that, well, for what God wants for you, that is actually health for humans. So essentially for 2,000 years, people were essentially told that, well, actually, what you think health is isn't right. What health is what God wants for you. So you're right in the sense that people with that kind of worldview would be able to readily accommodate the disjunct with human notions of what flourishing is. They would just say, no, it's actually what God wants. So you're right in the sense that yes, they would accommodate it, but they would accommodate it by a blanket insistence that God's idea of what is good is actually what is good for you. So in a sense, that just reinforces, I would say, Nussbaum's point that these top-down approaches are not perhaps ideally matched to the health of the individual.
And in that, just because I think that's a great point, Judith. At page 21, she says, the patient is essential in the medical case in a way that no human being or human practice seems to be essential in the other case, in the Platonic case. And, you know, the point in the background here too is before this, there was no medical analogy for the soul. So it means that once they refine this method or develop this method as a response to these two other kind of things that seem to be going on, this middle ground, what they do then is they invent the interiority, in a certain sense, of peoples. They have to come up with this complex psychology. They invent the unconscious, she says, you know? So they, through this approach, through an interest in what the good would be for this particular person, given an understanding of the norm of health and how life ought to be lived, but in those specific circumstances of that particular person, we get to discover the self. This is the beginning of the discovery of the self. And that's why it's significant. That's what she's banging on about. This is incredible. These schools invent what will later go on to be personality and the modern kind of psychology of the self.
Probably should move on because I probably went for a long time on that section.
But I think that's an important point, because if we stuck to a Platonic version of the self, we wouldn't have that level of interiority, or we might, but in a completely different way, in that kind of Foucauldian way, where we kind of have this kind of private thing that we have to confess to somebody or whatever. But here we've got an inner world of imagination and willpower and desire and aversion for various things. So anyway, yeah, unless you guys have got something to say about that, we can move on.
Just one final point, just on that, like that. It's like when you say, "Oh, but it would be so much better if this is true," but it's like, well, maybe it's not true. Maybe that, like, I think, like, Juice, you did a good job of like getting at what my point was with that God example. But like, if that is true, then like that's the thing we've got to try to find and identify. Like, our personal opinions of like, well, it would feel better and would have access to all these other faculties if this other thing was true. It doesn't seem like a reason that it is actually the case. Like,
yeah, I mean, it comes down, I guess, there's a certain amount of subjectivity, and I noted that with her examples about the women in India. You know, they're obviously from a kind of a progressive viewpoint. Yeah, they're kind of, yeah, there's a bit of a agenda there, I suppose, if you like. So yes, I mean, yes, if you do accept that what the Platonic spheres or what God wants for you is actually what is best, then the arguments around female agency and other things aren't going to cut any ice. So yes, there are room for and she does sort of slide to the conclusion that she wants to conclude. You're right. I mean, and yeah, and that's why, I mean, you're probably right, and sort of a Christian or a strongly Christian reader might infer that she makes an unwarrantable slide to her position, when in fact, yeah, what God wants is clearly what would be best for us.
So before we could even move on, could I just quickly say, to draw attention to her appeal to Rawls, and basically looking at it sort of like an epistemological idea of what, you know, how do we reach truth anyway, especially ethical truth, you know, and she appeals to Rawls in his argument that, you know, ethical theorizing is a practical matter. Sorry, what was I going to try and tell you? But you know, that even modern science philosophy is starting to get away a little bit from the Platonic idea, is what she brings up. You know, that idea that observation and measurement in scientific fields these days is you know, has shown that, the presence of the observer, and therefore that subjective element, even in philosophy of science now, so that ethics can claim truth, even if it's just on an anthropocentric platform, she says. So, we're on that same level of truth, the same level of achieving of same as science. So, it's sort of, we're reaching a bit more of common ground there. So just in the idea of that ethics can claim truth. Anyway, yeah.
And
that was the end of second section. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that fits well with what Shannon was talking about, because he wanted to talk about truth. And the Rawlsian thing, she kind of critiques a little bit, doesn't she? Because she says, well, Rawls is saying that ethical theorizing is essentially a practical matter. That's true. A matter not of discovering something that is fixed independently of our wishes, but a matter of constructing a view that we can live by together. But she says, however, Rawls is still taking quite a Platonic idea and approach to it by conceiving it along Platonic lines. Truth is conceived as having an altogether independent reality from our own lives, basically. So her point is that the Hellenistic schools, she says, do claim to pursue and state the truth, even though they conceive of ethics along pragmatic medical lines. She says it is not clear, in fact, so basically the truth can be part of our inner lives. There's no independence from it. You don't have to take a kind of, strictly speaking, Platonic stance that it must have some sort of independent reality out there separate from us. Hence her focusing on culture and historicity and things like that. But she even says that it's not even clear that even in science, that things are actually completely independent from our own theories and conceptions about reality. And that reminded me of a quote from back in my bad old university days, in which Karl Popper, I'll read you the quote because I looked it up. He says, the belief that science proceeds, everyone knows Karl Popper was into that. He came up with that demarcation stuff.
Yeah.
The belief that science proceeds from observation to theory is still so widely and so firmly held that my denial of it is often met with incredulity. I have even been suspected of being insincere, of denying what nobody in his senses would doubt. But in fact, the belief that we can start with pure observation alone without anything in the nature of a theory is absurd, as may be illustrated by the story of the man who dedicated his life to natural science, wrote down everything he could observe, and bequeathed his priceless collection of observations to the Royal Society to be used as evidence. This story should show us that though beetles may profitably be collected, observations may not. 25 years ago, I tried to bring home the same point to a group of physics students. And just to summarize, he asked them to observe, but he didn't tell them what to observe. So nobody knew how to act. And that's the point, is what we decide to observe, it has to be meaningful already to us in some way, that it already fits our conception of what's, worthy of noticing, for example. And she even says, even science's kind of most abstract goal, I guess, is anthropocentric, because it's to discover things, which is a human need.
Yes.
So given that, she says, if we can question the claims that science is, that science might have of its, truth being absolutely independent from human faculties and concerns, then it begins to make ethics look less disreputably different. It makes it less peculiar that speaking from within human life, it should claim truth. So, it's not about trying to find truth out there beyond ourselves. It's perfectly acceptable if we can critique, the ambiguity that science has around truth too, to find it within our own lives. I think that's a great point.
Yeah, I think it's a great passage. And it's important to remember when she was writing this, this was published in 1994, I think. And, as late as the late 80s, I would say, you know, that the virtue ethics perspective that that human life and human values are not kind of, that they are intimately related, and that yeah, it was still kind of revolutionary, you know. I think she was such a groundbreaker in this, as in so many other things. You know, we kind of take it for granted now because we've had 30 years of the virtue ethics revival. But when she was writing this, it was very much in its infancy. So yeah, kudos to her.
Which is a funny thought, because like there's like this alternative world, but this is like some obscure text that would have just disappeared if it hadn't, like, if virtue ethics hadn't gained as much popularity. Like it would have just been, you know, another obscure academic work.
Well, I mean, she in the preface she credits people who, you know, inspired her. So, and they're people like Julia Annis, Miles Burnyeat, A.A. Long, David Sedley, all the people that we're familiar with from the virtue ethics revival. So, you know, she was part of that, but she was also breaking new ground, I reckon.
Okay. She does say, however, that we can go a little bit further, right? And she says there's three considerations that she can offer that kind of help to qualify those grounds for truth validity. And she gives, you know, those three things. She says internal consistency, that's the first one. Second one is correspondence, and three is broad coherence and fit. So the first part, internal consistency, is a large part of the medical argument consists in scrutiny and the sorting out of beliefs towards the end of consistency. And this is great because isn't that what Stoicism, for example, and I'm sure Epicureanism does exceptionally well. It creates a really systematic and cohesive worldview. There's not like we have in our modern worldview, there's all these discrete kind of arguments or explanations or kind of discourses floating around. Everything is reduced to a common substance, like literally, which is reason. So emotion is not this separate part of the self even. It's a kind of cognitive function that operates very similar to belief and is amenable to the same kind of mechanisms that form belief or that we can use to modify belief. So that gives it an extra layer of, you know, of validity, a kind of way that she's here saying is some sort of evidence for truth. And do you guys want to add anything to that, or do you know what the next one is? Correspondence. Correspondence,
isn't that where language is associated or directly corresponds with the thing in itself? Is that it? Is that what
not really. What she means is in the medical description, correspondence means that the account of the philosophy has to correspond with the deepest of human wishes and needs and desires. So it's, again, this is just restating how it's different from the Platonic approach, I think. It has to be with human nature, it says. So, yeah, she uses something fancy, correspondence between ethical theory and the deepest levels of the patient's soul. But, and the third part, broad coherence and fit, she just says, and this makes sense too, that all the theories we discover must cohere with our best theories in other areas of inquiry. So we would imagine, and this is what Stoicism does so exceptionally well, of course, that there's great coherence between their physics and their psychology and their ethics and so on. There's this, what we know about one area supports the other area. There's not contradiction, which is the kind of thing that you often find in our, I don't know, maybe I'm being too unfair, but I feel like these Hellenistic schools just really nail those aspects. They really, really find methods of description that tie it all together so perfectly, which aids, of course, that process of memorization, which is so important because the worldview is so deeply interconnected with itself.
Yeah, and that interconnection or integration is kind of, well, we're going to be reading Jung shortly, aren't we? So he draws attention to the importance and significance of integration and coherence in a psychic sense. So yeah, the ancients paid due attention to that.
And what a beautiful kind of medicine of the soul. Like if you're learning about a system and committing it to some sort of intellectual understanding, where you are starting to model yourself on the principles of the macrocosm, if you like, that macrocosm that you're studying is deeply interconnected and has a kind of it's deeply understandable, and you know what I mean. There's no kind of, I don't know, like lost mysteries that are impossible to kind of understand. The world becomes completely knowable, and the consequence for you then is this kind of, there has to be some sort of existential groundedness or like feeling of complete self-discovery, that it is possible to fully know oneself in a fully knowable cosmos, for example. That just there, those kind of things that the Hellenistic philosophy do is that subtle art, that subtle medicine that's completely lacking. And in fact, Augustine complained about the Platonic version of the soul, remember, in the Confessions, because he said it doesn't get you far enough. You get stuck at the level of the intellect, and then it doesn't fulfill any of its promises. And that's where he found faith took him to the next level. But see, we get it from a very different kind of perspective in the medical analogy. The interiority links up with the cosmos at large. Are we up to 3, or did you guys have something to riff on?
We can move on.
I get a bit preachy when we're talking about Nussbaum and the Stoics, sorry. So 3 is really about, she introduces the common conception or ordinary belief. I just wanted to say about this too, that I'd forgotten about this mostly, and lately, having read a lot of Stoicism lately, I was really struck by the observation that there's this common opinion that Stoics are definitely critiquing. And then rereading this, I was like, oh yeah, it's the ordinary belief side of the coin, clearly, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, there are certain texts, and I'm trying to think, it's not coming to me straight away which texts they are, but certain Stoic texts which are very severe on the influence of social beliefs and socialization, essentially, in fostering false beliefs and preferences in people.
Yeah. I was reading Margaret Graver's book recently, the Stoicism and Emotion. There's a good section on there about, I think, Chalcidius, or however you say his name. And that's all about that, the ways in which, it's in that chapter on the twofold cause, so how the senses deceive us, but also how poor social teaching transmits those lies, those kind of distortions, those unhealthy beliefs, and makes them widespread, basically. And that's what's going on here, basically, is she says that the ordinary belief idea is that the idea that ethical inquiry and teaching are simply the recording of traditional social belief and have no legitimate goal beyond this. This is a kind of subjectivism, in a sense, or a kind of whatever the culture says goes, survival of the fittest, all that. It makes you think of Socrates with his argument with what was his name, Callicles, you know, might is right. And she says it begins from an assumption of social health as opposed to the Hellenistic, the medical analogy, which will begin with an assumption of being highly skeptical towards the kind of mainstream social beliefs. But she then says this particular view was probably played a major role in ancient moral education. Its starting point, the common conception view, the ordinary belief, the starting point, if not its end, is central to many forms of utilitarianism, she says, in terms of the maximization of satisfactions. The material from which it starts is, in fact, the totality of the desires and preferences of all the people concerned, regardless of the degree of scrutiny to which these preferences have been subjected. You know, the more I think about this stuff too, the more I think this is exactly the kind of stuff that's crept into modern psychology. You know, psychology at some point maybe wanted to have something that resembled that medical analogy, but more and more it's just slipped into this kind of uncritical acceptance of the common belief. So it's down to the point where now it's like, you know, there's no real goal, there's no normative health. And that's what she says there later on. She says psychoanalysis has not always been willing to commit itself to a normative idea of health. It is frequently sufficient if the patient is relieved of certain obvious incapacities. And that's right.
Just before you go too far, like just on that utilitarian point, it's so like, not to say there's not utilitarians that are like that, but it's a very broad brush. Like, because real utilitarians wouldn't apply to them.
No, she doesn't mean that. She means it is utilitarian in itself, in that it takes the mass of people, all of the people, and takes their desires, the totality of their desires and preferences as the good.
We're not talking about philosophical utilitarianism. We're talking about Nussbaum's.
No, she is, and that's why she uses a capital U. But
Yeah.
I think, I mean, again, you can't quite expect her to be distinguishing between active utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism in this context, you know? She's just making a general point, Shannon. I think you're being a bit picky.
I know, but it's like, it's just sort of this throwaway line where it just doesn't need to be there. Like this is like the thing that I was saying before, where it's like, I feel like she's a really good writer. And it's just like, these things are there, and it's like, why? Especially this, where it's like, how much of a sentence is it? It's like 1.5 sentences. Delete it.
But I don't see it as problematic. To me, it makes a lot of sense.
It was, to be fair, again, this is probably relevant to the context in which she was writing. And,
maybe,
you know, in the 80s and 90s, utilitarianism was still like the dominant form of ethical belief. You know, this is what was the context.
Yeah, and if you're talking about ordinary belief,
I withdraw my critique on the basis that there could have been some historical factors of the type utilitarianism that was around at her time.
Oh my God, I'm just shocked. Shannon always defers to Judith, but he never to me. Yes. Come on, this is so unfair. But
yeah, correct.
If we're talking about ordinary belief, the common ordinary belief, then talking about utilitarianism makes perfect sense, right? I can see the fit.
What do you mean? It doesn't make perfect sense. I just don't see, how do you see that connection between, like, we're talking about what people think, therefore utilitarianism? I just don't. I would use those two words.
I think. Sorry, you go.
I was just going to say, sorry, Courtney, but I think she's just using it as a shorthand for kind of common, you know, maybe policy-based ideas around well-being, you know, and yes, to the extent that probably policymakers don't have a clue that what they're actually doing is utilitarianism, except that it kind of probably is. So I think she's giving them the benefit of the doubt to the extent of knowing what they're doing, which broadly speaking probably is utilitarianism. Okay, so again, she's just using a bit of a shorthand there, I would say. But what do you think she's doing, Shannon?
I don't know. It's just such a weird thing to do. Like just being like, oh yeah, so I'm gonna make this generalization of like one of the biggest moral philosophies around. It's just like, why do this? I just delete it. It doesn't need to be there. It doesn't help your argument. I don't. I think her point, like I agree, there is a point that's being made there. A perfectly valid point to make around this idea of like preferences of like everyone, that sort of thing. But just get rid of utilitarianism and it solves everything.
Well, she does give a footnote 20. And I think, again, another element of this context is I'm pretty sure both her partners in this period, Amartya Sen and Cass Sunstein, were both political scientists and economists. So she gives a footnote about contemporary philosophical versions of utilitarianism almost all introduce substantial qualifications here, recognizing that preferences formed under certain conditions are not reliable. Economic utilitarianism usually takes a simpler view. So I think she, at least somebody probably said to her in the drafting process something similar to what you said, Shannon, and she put in that footnote.
Yeah, that definitely that addresses the exact thing that I was talking about. One of the other points you make, Courtney, there was just you were saying that this view is like subjective, like subjectivism, but isn't sort of I guess like this depends what you mean by subjectivism. So,
you can.
Like, wouldn't the medical analogy be subjectivism because at basis it's the desires of the patient, so to speak?
Not at all, because they're working within the realm of the client's patients and within the patient's desires and wishes and things like that, yet trying to find a way to establish norms, norms of health, and then apply that to the specific concrete situation of the person's life. That's why I see it as a bit of a middle place between the kind of harsh abstractness of the Platonic kind of picture and the kind of pure subjectivism of the ordinary belief, which really just takes every different possible perspective and treats them all as good as each other, as equivalent.
Yeah, but it seems like this is agent dependent. Like this view is like we're saying that it's dependent on the agents what is good and what isn't. Like it's not like there's some good that exists independent. There's a lot of different definitions about subjectivism, so we might just be talking past each other on this point.
Yeah, maybe. I think. Sorry, you go.
Probably.
Well, I mean, she does make the point, and I can't quite remember where it is. It might be a bit further on. I'm not sure. Where where she discusses where the patient may be under misapprehensions about what's going on, and the patient's own report is unreliable. So she's not unaware of the pitfalls of subjective perspectives at all. In fact, she takes a great deal of care to address that. So at the bottom of page 26, she says, on the one hand, then, the medical model is committed to trusting the patient at some level. Sooner or later, the philosopher hopes that all or most patients will assent to the diagnosis and participate willingly in the cure. But, and she goes on to say that there are influences which have formed the patient's beliefs about the good life, and there's going to be some disagreement and some uncertainty about what's really going on there. So I think she's very aware of any issues around the subjective and the the mistakes of the subjective experience.
Yeah, from the point of view of the medical analogy. But if you were an advocate of the ordinary belief, then you would just be going along with whatever social convention is there, which is, from the medical analogy point of view, is harmful and impedes flourishing and all that sort of stuff.
But doesn't it seem again that it's like I didn't think as much about this part, and I don't want to get lost on it either. But like similar to the Platonists, it seems like she's just not giving a fair shake to the ordinary belief people either, because it's kind of like going, well, it's wrong because the medical analogy is true. And it's like, well, yeah, okay, that is correct. If the medical analogy is true, then this is wrong. But I didn't really consider this as fully, so I'm sort of talking on the fly. So I might be.
Well, my take on it is, based on my very judgmental experience, is if you can imagine you're seeing a psychologist and you might have some, I don't know, like from a normative point of view, some pretty radically strange ways of going about doing things in your life. But the therapist might convince you that everyone's different, everyone's got different values. It's just you've got to accept whatever your kind of weirdness is, even if it causes you a great deal of discomfort, That's a very common approach nowadays. The medical analogy kind of guy is a bit kind of getting a little bit old-fashioned, really, like especially if we're thinking in terms of virtue ethics, because we're saying, well, no, not everything is okay. Certain forms of belief are harmful and shouldn't be practiced. You might not want to change, or you might feel you're unable to change because you feel that you're different and everyone is different. Let's work with that. Let's explore that. Remember, this is a process. So then you explore that, but all the while you're drawing on outside sources to challenge the kind of models of belief that you have in order to, through persuasive argument or through various, dialectical techniques, or even, like she says, you need better techniques to do this method. So using whatever is required, and maybe it's meditation or, trance, God knows, whatever kind of techniques you need in order to disrupt that harmful belief. So in order for them to do any of this work, the doctor, the medical philosopher, has to have a very strong opinion about what kind of belief is appropriate and what kinds aren't. So hence the idea of a normative ethic. But they can't just force it on the client. They have to find a way to get the client to become a participant and a collaborator, and to decide that such a process would radically improve their lives. And that's the point of, she says, the medical model has to be seen to be improving the life of the patient. And if it can't do that, then it can't succeed in its purpose. So there's this point the Stoics are trying to make too, that if you can see clearly what's good for you, you'll be persuaded by it. And Socrates makes the same claim as well. And interestingly, Socrates, as Judith will tell you, makes this idea that you don't even need to appeal to the ordinary belief. You only have to appeal to the witness within the single person, because there's something in that person's own sense of right and wrong, for example, that you can work on, and that you can show them that what, next to the normative case of the truth, if somehow you give the right kind of arguments, they'll be won over. I probably put that really badly, but you might want to expand on that.
Yeah, but I think my sort of thing would be that trying to push it, it's sort of like this thing of where she's sort of going through them and trying to knock them both down, and it just feels like she's not really giving either of them a fair shake in her defense of them, or presenting what the defense would be from a reasonable person of those positions. I think that probably.
I think she's incredibly fair. I think I can't think of another book where somebody has addressed the potential competing theories in the way she has. I think you're being incredibly. I don't see it, Shannon, at all. I think what struck me with reading this chapter is how she's carefully anticipated disagreements and has address them in a kind of a thoughtful way, you know. It's funny, we're reading the same text.
Yeah, it's just that Platonist one is like by far the worst. The ordinary one I probably don't have as strong opinions on, but it kind of sort of feels the same way, where it's sort of like, oh no, but this one's wrong. Let's move on to what I actually want to talk about. It's like shuffling, you got the corpse, you sort of shuffled it out, like, look, they're dead. Let's move on. Oh, look, this is the alive person. I don't know where that analogy was going.
I think she's really considered a lot of different arguments, like Judith is saying. For example, I got thinking about Socrates' desire to call out the witness for the individual, and he makes a point of saying, I'm not interested in the opinion of the group. I'm gonna make you your own witness. That's the person I have to convince. Well, she says in here something like something about Socrates' dialectic is reserved for a certain class of person, and the general average Joe Schmo doesn't have access to that education, those tools, so it doesn't work for him. But I was thinking about also something I read in A.A. Long in his Epictetus, Stoic and Socratic Guide to Life. He says, in the absence of a Socrates, because of his amazingly powerful dialectical skills in that, we may not be able to achieve the kind of things that the Stoics are talking about. But this is where Nussbaum's kind of hitting the nail on the head again, because she's saying, no, they're not doing what Socrates was trying to do. You don't need Socrates. What they've done is they've refined it into a medical art. So now they've got the unconscious. Now they've got tools for dealing with the unconscious. They're not relying on calm dialectic. They don't have to merely draw out the single witness and use Socratic dialectic against it. That's part of the technique. But the rest of the technique is all these kind of tools that they've developed, this whole worldview that they can bring to bear down against the client in order to change his perspective. I think it's a great book. It's amazing.
Just to move us along, because I'm aware of time, just on page 28, I just wanted to point this out because I just think it's kind of funny. And this is more me reading it, so it's more funny. But it starts with like, her job as a philosopher, as Cicero reminds the Stoic, is not simply to give lectures, but to speak to real people. And my little note I put next to that was, so philosophers are not real people. That's what she's trying to say there.
God, you're so picky.
No, I said I'm not. This is not what I think she actually meant.
Well, I think she chose her words really carefully. I don't think she's saying things that she doesn't mean.
I don't think she's actually saying this. I just think that it might, as a more amusing way to read it, was that she was saying philosophers aren't real people, and I just thought that was funny. But yeah, I agree that that's not what she's saying.
And again, that's the point she makes about Socrates. Like that whole idea that he's got a very privileged way of using knowledge and almost unmatched ability to use argumentation. But if we're going to be these medical doctor types, we've got to be able to speak in a way that the common Joe can be moved by and can use as well in their own lives. So that's how I interpret that. I know you like to take things a little bit literally, but
if it's funny, yeah. It's just the idea of like not calling philosophers people. I love that as an idea, but it's definitely not what she meant, but still funny.
Talking about literal things, I heard a joke the other day that kind of scrambles up that sort of thinking too, Shannon. How do you get a country girl's attention?
You go to the country?
A tractor.
That's brilliant. And you know what they have in the country? Nature, which is section 4. Which I'd be interested to hear what other people's thoughts were on this, because yeah, I sort of made my point known. But yeah, especially like where you feel that she's actually giving the explanation of what nature is for the ancients. I'd be curious on that.
Well, weren't we just going? I mean, I know we read a little bit more, but weren't we? Should we leave that to next time? Because I think we've probably gone far enough. Have we? Were we going to do 4 as well, or was it 3?
We're still in chapter 1.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah.
obviously I
We've
didn't read
actually
far
got
enough.
nine. There was 9 sections we had to
Oh,
get through.
okay.
That's right.
I'll just read my notes just quickly, so you can stop me as it gets to bits that you think are annoying or whatever. So talking about norms, nature and natural. So she's saying that they have often been bound up with the Platonist scientific ideas, account of the way the world is. So the Platonists and the scientific way of looking at this is it's the way the world is without human intervention or shaping, right? And then so nature is a repository, or as a repository of extra historical and transcendent values. So the kind of things you go and find out there in the universe, independent of ourselves, which she was sort of critiquing earlier. And she says you see this same sort of thing in modern sociobiology, that nature is seen as a source of value-free facts. So I was wondering exactly what that meant, but I assume things like gender relations and social hierarchy and stuff like that we try to explain in evolutionary biological terms nowadays. So do you want to say anything? So do you disagree with that, Shannon? That's her idea of norm as it would apply to the Platonic view?
So that wasn't so much that. So it's more because actually she presents these views, and then page. So I think what you're looking is like page 29 at the start, and then at page 30, midway through, she then goes, the ancient appeals to nature that we will be considering do not have these features, and then it's like she sort of gets into what it is, but yeah.
She says ancient appeals to nature do not pretend to derive value norms from a value-free account of the scientific underpinnings of human life. That's kind of what we were talking about before, that you find them in your life. And she says that norms are value-laden and that they select some aspects as important over others. Well, that makes sense, you know. So, for example, with the Stoics, we know that they value reason over control of things outside of us, for example. And she says they do this selecting of the right kind of aspects, often by appealing to the actual sense of value of a human being, asking whether a life without X or Y would be impoverished, that we would be, well, so impoverished that we would be unwilling to think of it as a human life at all, which makes perfect sense. Think about the Stoics. What would life be like if you couldn't manage your own life, if you didn't have rational autonomy, if you didn't have the integrity of a kind of a self independent from other selves? You know, that's the kind of idea that they place in the realm of the norm. And if you imagine like a Stoic, what would life be like without that kind of rational focus? Taken to the extreme, yeah, it would be shit. It wouldn't be worth living, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does.
Sorry, I'm going to have to leave. It's a bit I'm just a bit tired, so
Yeah,
I'm going to
it's 9
tune
o'clock.
out. Yeah.
Well, we can pack up. We can revisit this end bit in the next chapter. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks everyone. It's been a big session, but I reckon we'll pick up on norms in when we do chapter 2, because norms is an interesting thing, and I reckon we could talk about it for a while. It's an important subject. Yeah.
Yeah. I like when I was reading this again, I was like, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to talk ages about the things I have wrong about the book. Yeah, I failed at that.
That's good, because it gives us an opportunity to kind of describe why we think or what we think it means and so on. So no, I appreciate that. Thanks so much, Judith.
Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, everyone. It's good to be back.
So,
Yeah,
see you
good to
next
see
time.
you. Thanks,
All right.
everybody.
Good night,
See you next
everyone.
time.
Bye bye.
See you next time.